Although America has long prided itself as the land of opportunity, forms of inequity, like the rise in racial wealth inequality, has taken hold in the American experience. In developing an explanation to such unseen levels, scholars have identified housing laws and tax laws as factors accountable for its perpetuation. Although other factors aside from governmental policy have driven the racial wealth gap, certain federal laws, both modern and historical, have exacerbated its growth, granted their role in creating an atmosphere favorable to the affluent. Before we dive into deeper analysis, it's imperative that we note the difference between wealth and income. Wealth is based on the total assets minus debts accumulated by a family, while income is a minor component of those assets. Though income may cover the needs of a family, wealth allows families to withstand economic shocks, to afford opportunities, and pass along their status to the next generation. In the context of race, the cleavage in wealth has grown increasingly pronounced. In 1983, the median net worth of white households was 8 times greater than that of black families. By 2016, this gap grew sharply, with the median net worth of white families averaging 10 times greater than that of black families. In assessing the racial wealth divide, scholars have collected data on racial wealth disparities on account of home ownership. Home ownership is the main asset from which most households build their wealth. According to the Federal Reserve Board, homeownership equity accounted for nearly 46% of wealth of black families and 27% of the wealth of white families. Based on the sum of individual freehold, homeownership entitles families to tax deductions and higher credit scores, allowing households to preserve and optimize their earnings. Yet, where race is considered, the frequency of homeownership is vastly unequal. According to the apartment list survey, among homeowners in 2015, 65% were white, while a third were black. Since minorities are underrepresented as homeowners, the benefits of home ownership are mainly weighted towards white households. To this end, differences in home ownership have driven the financial vulnerability of non-white households, and in effect become the single largest driver of racial wealth inequality. Today, the main underpinnings of the racial wealth gap can be traced to major policies of the 20th century. Faced by housing shortages in 1934, the federal government initiated measures through the Fair Housing Act to provide housing to white families and to further segregation by denying housing loans to African Americans, a policy known as redlining. Such exclusionist practices confined African Americans to the poorer sectors of the city, where economic opportunity was largely absent. In the absence of such property benefits, minorities were robbed of asset building opportunities, while white Americans secured the opportunity of a financially brighter future in the fast growing suburbs. To this end, the Fair Housing Act undercut the social mobility of African Americans, thereby contributing to the racial wealth gap. So far, many explanations for the racial wealth gap often label individual life choices as the main driver. However, modern policies, such as mortgage deductions, have reinforced the divide between whites and non-whites. Mortgage interest deductions, or MID, allows homeowners to receive deduction on the interest paid for residential loans. With mortgage interest deductions, most homeowners are able to hold on to and maximize their savings. Yet, due to a legacy of exclusionary housing laws, Black Americans have been denied access to such amenities. In 2015, about 64% of white Americans were homeowners, compared with just about a third of U.S. blacks. Such data indicates that the MID has tilted the scales of benefits in the favor of white Americans. This lack of homeownership among African Americans has also translated into a tendency to pay higher interest rates. Though done in good faith, the MID has rewarded white families with wealth-enhancing benefits while leaving African American assets untouched and in turn preserving injustices of historical exclusion. Thus, to a tremendous degree, the MID has accentuated the divide in racial net worth. To counteract the effects of the MID, America must reform its tax structure to address its racial consequences. Due to a legacy of systematic racism, homeownership rates among African Americans pale in comparison to that of whites. Such imbalance has bred an unequal sharing of wealth building opportunities furnished by the MID. Under the MID, only 20% of households receive any benefit at all, compared to just 77% of the wealthiest households today. By focusing on homeowners, however, MID neglects an entire group of renters, which, according to the Pew Research Center, account for 58% of African Americans. Thus, given that a sizable amount of renters are Black Americans, a tax credit geared toward promoting the wealth accrual of renters should be implemented by the national government. This new tax credit, also known as the renter's tax credit, will establish a cap on rent, thereby allowing renters to conserve their money. By shifting the tides equally in favor of renters, a renter's tax credit will help level the playing field between white and Black Americans, thereby alleviating the racial wealth gap. In view of the issue itself, the topic of racial wealth inequality instantly grabbed my attention because, as an African American, I often wondered why such a distinct difference in wealth existed in a country that cherished equality. So, when I was granted the opportunity to explore a topic of my choice, my inquiry of whether the racial wealth disparity was a result of historic oppression or individual choices drove me to choose this topic.